So, I will begin by a brief account of what happened in Nepal, since many of you might not be familiar. Um, the Nepali Maoists, who were inspired by the Indian Maoists many decades ago, beginning in the 1960s, started a insurgency against the Nepali state in 1996, and very quickly they became the most, let's say, successful left-wing armed group in the region, in Southeast Asia, certainly probably across Southeast Asia too. Within 5 years, they had managed to consolidate control over very large territory. Maybe around, even it is estimated that 70 to 80% of rural areas were under direct Maoist influence, if not total control. Um, the army was mobilized against them in 2001, but that did not stop the spread of the movement. And in 2005 and 2006, the Maoists, in alliance with with mainstream political forces, the parliamentary parties, um, staged a mass movement against the regime at that time, led by the king. It was a military, monarchical regime, and that regime was brought down, and many aspects of the Maoist agenda became part of mainstream Nepali political discourse. They succeeded in getting rid of the monarchy. They succeeded in establishing a secular state, and they succeeded in establishing a constituent assembly to draft a new constitution. And in elections in 2008, they emerged, they became the largest party in parliament, and they were in government for a certain period of time. And at the current time too, our Prime Minister is, he was head of the Maoist Party. So I would like to divide my presentation into two parts. First, explain a few points as to why their movement was successful, what were the underlying features behind their success. Some have to do with the characteristics of the movement itself. Some have to do with the political circumstances and the nature of the state at that time. And secondly, I would like to briefly explore what happened to the armed movement after they entered mainstream politics and the difficulties they have faced after coming to power. I think Nepal is often taken to be a great success of mainstreaming armed groups, of so-called saying from bullet to the ballot box, and that is true to some extent. But also there are problems in the mainstreaming of former armed groups, of which the Maoists offer lessons. So to begin with, all left-wing armed movements worth their salt in this part of the world try to establish control over territory and population in rural areas, in order to, and use that as a base from which to wage their assaults upon urban areas or administrative areas. And in order to do so, the original, let's say that most of the left-wing movements that we are familiar with are inspired by communism directly, more particularly Maoism and the strategy of protracted people's war, which includes establishing base areas and attacking the cities through their base areas. But the ideology of Maoism in today, or over the last 2 decades in this part of the world, is not sufficient to gain political legitimacy and political support, because the idea, it's too abstract. Communism as an ideology doesn't resonate. It's seen to be outdated. So the first thing that left-wing movements have to do in order to both gain some support among the population and also appear in public as possessing legitimate political demands is to create a relationship with a certain ethnic group, and a marginalized ethnic group, an ethnic group that hasn't received enough attention by the state over the years. A promise to them that they will, that the Maoists are taking care of their interests and will bring a massive transformation in their lives after they come to power. And And one reason for the Maoist success in Nepal was because they were quite successful in doing this. And not only, I mean, there was one region in Nepal where they were politically active for at least 4 decades before they started an insurgency. And the people in that area, the Khammagars of Midwestern Nepal, were very strong Maoist supporters. But the Maoists also created a narrative which brought together many different ethnic groups all across the country into an overarching framework. Um, briefly, that was the first reason for why they were able to spread so fast. Nepal being a very diverse country of many different ethnic groups, they were able to get support in this way. Secondly, they managed to survive because from very early on, they were, the political strategy always dominated the military strategy. Of course, among left-wing movements and Maoist communists, it's always, all of them say that politics dominates military. There's always a political commissar who's superior to the military guy. But in practice, there is a tendency for insurgencies based in remote areas to turn into completely militaristic ventures. You establish control over population, you're unable to expand very far, and it just turns into a vicious spiral where you're just using force all the time and unable to go beyond your immediate vicinity. The Maoists very early on in Nepal realized that they would not be able to break out of their base areas and enter urban areas because the administration and the security forces are too powerful. So that it was, eventually they would have to reach a negotiated settlement. And they were, even from the very early days of the war, of the conflict, they were always talking to political forces with a view towards achieving a long-term political resolution. It took them a long time, a decade for it to happen. But this was one way in which they managed to transition into a mainstream political force. Third, and here we get to the weaknesses of the state itself. It really benefited the Maoists that the state acted in the way it did. Beginning 2001, when the army entered the conflict, there was a severe erosion of democracy. The army preferred the king as a ruler, and with the support of the army, the king sidelined all the political parties. Because at that time the thinking was that all these political bickering is harming the fight against the Maoists because governments are changing every 6 months to a year, there's instability, the parties kind of are focusing more on undermining each other than combating the Maoists. This was the thinking. So the king decided, beginning with the dissolution of parliament in 2002, the political parties were steadily sidelined. And then the regime also thought that human rights activists in the media were playing a very negative role, by raising issues of excesses or, the media was undermining the army's morale, revealing secrets, this kind of thing. So there was a concerted campaign against the media and human rights activists also. But over a very short period of time, this created an environment where almost all sections of society were united against the government. The political party, the media, and the human rights activists who were by no means Maoist sympathizers. This came to a point where they decided it was better to ally with the Maoists rather than anyone in government, than with the king or the military. So yesterday too, the numerous people have said at this conference that militaristic solutions alone cannot offer a solution. Governance is also important, but a political resolution is also important. I think Nepal demonstrates, a case study, and the lesson of which is it's good to demonstrate caution in the use of military force and the centralization of power. So generally, these are the three things. I'll leave it here. I won't get into the complexities of it, except for maybe saying that it's interesting also that India at this time, in 2005, when it was fighting a Maoist insurgency of its own, decided to facilitate an agreement between the parliamentary parties and the Maoists against the monarchy, which eventually led to the toppling of the king. Again demonstrating that how many people the regime had alienated in its fight against the Maoists. I mean, if India itself, which was fighting an internal war of its own, came to this position, it demonstrates how unpopular the Nepali state had become. So since then, I mean, as I mentioned earlier, the Maoists, they joined government. They were very popular for a certain period of time. Our prime minister now is Prachanda. You can say that there are many successes that they've accomplished. It's a successful case of transition from a rebel group to political party, and which is all true. But also today, I would not like to focus on that. I would like to focus on the negative aspects, and you can see that the Maoists today are a very pale version of what they once were. They're very weak. They're divided. They're no longer a united party. They're divided into at least 4 different groups. And their political future is in question at the moment, even though even within the movement. And there are many reasons why this occurred, why they are in this situation now. But briefly, you can say that when a rebel group transitions to a political party, it's not sufficient just simply to participate in elections. It requires a major change in the style of functioning of that political party itself. And if that does not occur, if the structure of the organization is such as prevailed during wartime, major problems will emerge in the future. The Maoist party during war was a very centralized party. It was Stalinist in organization. There was one supreme commander who was in charge of all sections. Internal debate was allowed within the party, but decisions were taken in a centralized, sometimes conspiratorial manner, and the entire party organization was forced to accept these decisions. And at a time of conflict, perhaps this was necessary. The rank and file were willing to put some blind faith in their leaders. But once you come into power, the same organization that was once a strength becomes a liability, because it does not allow for any internal movement within the party. It does not allow for younger people to rise within. It does not allow for dissent. There are no elections within the party. The same person who's led the party for over 30 years continues to lead it to this day. And the style of decision making became increasingly divorced from the rank and file. There was no public discussion. And as a result, disillusionment emerged. I mean, on the one hand, the party leadership took all these decisions without making a deep effort or without being unable to convince many radical sections of the party about why they joined the peace process, without accomplishing many of their major goals, like capture of the state, for example. So as a result, the more radical sections of the party left the party, and now they're in 2 separate factions. On the other hand, the leadership was unable to get the support of the sections of the party that were also more democratic in nature, that wanted to compete, that wanted to kind of become a viable parliamentary party, that believed in elections, that believed in competitive democracy from the grassroots up to the center. But this faction too was sidelined, and because there was no scope for this faction to play a major role within the party, this faction left as well. Baburam Bhattrai was here yesterday. He gave a talk. He was the 2nd highest ranking Maoist in the movement, and last year he quit to form a party of his own. So this is a factor. I mean, this is a big challenge. The other thing was, from the outside, the Maoist army that was demobilized. Initially, the Maoists said that there will be a big integration and rehabilitation process where a lot of Maoist combatants would be integrated into the Nepal army, with a few sent off to, with a retirement package or something like that. But due to political circumstances, this was almost entirely rejected at the end, and the Maoist leadership accepted to very small token integration. of around 1,000 combatants into the Nepal army. And the rest of them were sent home, and there was a lot of anger within the party in the movement against this. And the Maoist combatants felt that they'd been dealt in a very humiliating way. There were around 4,000 combatants who were discharged as being so-called disqualified because they were not of age when they joined, or like they joined after a certain date. So these combatants kind of, continue to feel really alienated and angry against the state and the party to this day. There were thousands of others who received voluntary retirement, so-called voluntary retirement, and were just packed off and not having any connection to either the party organization anymore. Now these were people who had left their homes in the middle of the conflict or before, to go across their identity was that of a party member. They'd lost their original identities as members of society. And once they lost their identity as party members too, they entered into a kind of very anomic, isolated existence. Very difficult for them to get a job or kind of try to work for a living, stigmatized by the communities they live among. And this group of people became very amenable to the idea of again restarting an armed movement against the state. And there is a faction of the Maoist Party that is trying to organize these people into, into an organization that can again be effective. They're trying to reestablish base areas, parallel governments, possibly thinking about establishing violence in the future. I'm not saying this is an immediate possibility, but it could occur. And I think this was due to a failure by both the government and the Maoist Party to adequately handle the social dimension of dealing with former combatants after the war. So I received a note. I think my time is up. We can discuss more things in the Q&A if you're interested. I'll stop here. Thank you very much.